So welcome everyone. We're very glad to have you here today in our webinar. We'll be discussing the great report from the Global Commission on Evidence to Address Societal Problems. We're very happy to have the presence of Professor John Levis from McMaster, Professor Ulysses from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and Tamile Diaz from ENAP, and also Professor Jorge Barreto from Fiocruz Brasilia, who will help us today debate with these wonderful guests. We're very, very happy to be part of the Glocal Week as well. This webinar is organized by the Brazilian Coalition for Evidence, which is a collective of 45 different organizations that are dedicated to evidence-informed policymaking in Brazil. So this is such a wonderful moment to debate evidence after COVID pandemic and all the lessons we have learned, and how we can better this debate in Brazil, and how can we take steps towards institutionalization of evidence-informed policymaking in our country. So without further ado, I just wanted to give room to Professor John Levis to present their wonderful work at the Commission, and we'll start the debate afterwards.
Great, thanks very much, Laura. Can you just confirm that you can see my slides and hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Great, excellent. Thank you very, very much for having me. Hopefully we'll get back to the days of travel and I'll have a chance to see many of you again in real life, but it's a delight to interact with you virtually today. So the overview of what I'm going to walk through are, first I'm going to start with where the Evidence Commission came from, and it really came from challenges but also opportunities that we saw with the COVID-19 evidence response through a network called COVIDend. And then I'll walk through some of the key concepts and some of the key recommendations that are introduced in the Evidence Commission report. And I'll conclude with what, for the Evidence Commission Secretariat, are our current implementation priorities. And those relate to strengthening domestic evidence infrastructures, which cuts right to the heart of what Glocal is about and the debate that we'll be having later in the panel. Second, enhancing and leveraging the global evidence architecture. So countries like Brazil can pull in insights from around the globe and complement local or national evidence. And then finally, putting evidence at the center of everyday life, which is our citizen-targeted recommendation. So I'll start with the impetus for the Evidence Commission. It came from what at the time was a year of supporting decision-making. It's now 26 months of supporting decision-making about COVID-19, all aspects of it, public health measures, clinical management, health system arrangements, and economic and social responses. COVIDend is a partnership of 55 global partners, world-leading groups, many of whom act as an umbrella for other partners, and you'll see 5 examples on the left side of this screen. Many of COVIDend's global partners anchor the evidence infrastructure in their country, and you'll see in the left, I've circled Fiocruz Brasilia as one of the COVIDend partners that is a critical part of the Brazilian evidence ecosystem. 2 examples of COVIDend's achievements. One is in the area of ultra-rapid and living evidence syntheses. The ultra-rapid syntheses were efforts to contextualize the evidence for decisions in a particular context. The living evidence syntheses were evidence-related global public goods that could be used by anybody around the globe. And you'll see some examples here of the living evidence syntheses, vaccine effectiveness in adults, separately in children and adolescents, and finally for waning immunity. Another example of an achievement was the COVIDend inventory of evidence syntheses to improve the signal to noise ratio related to evidence for use in COVID-19 decision-making. the last time I pulled the numbers from the inventory, we had gone from more than 13,000 syntheses about COVID-19 down to roughly 5% of the total that we considered to be the best evidence syntheses for the full range of COVID decisions. The good news about the evidence response to COVID-19 is we'd never before seen such demand for evidence from political leaders, nor such innovations in evidence products and processes. But some of the worrying things that we noticed with the COVID-19 evidence response was the low signal to noise ratio. And this slide is about the signal to noise ratio with evidence syntheses. You'll see very uneven coverage, few syntheses about economic and social responses, many about clinical management, low quality. So unfortunately, roughly 1 in every 4 syntheses about COVID-19 was low quality. They are in light blue. Roughly 1/2 were only of medium quality, they're in yellow or gold, and only 1/4 were high quality, and they're in that more pink color. They were also frequently outdated because a lot of rapid reviews were done, but in an area of fast-moving science and a fast-moving context, a review from 6 months ago could be wildly out of date. Had we invested globally in a suite of high quality living evidence syntheses, we would have saved tremendous amounts of research waste globally and allowed countries to instead focus on contextualizing evidence alongside national evidence in an equity sensitive way. A second of the 3 problems that I'll highlight with the COVID-19 evidence response is a big focus on preprints that had not been independently assessed for quality and placed alongside all the other studies addressing the same question in the form of living evidence synthesis. A lot of what we called squeaky wheel experts, experts who didn't speak in a way that allowed us to judge their accuracy. They were never explicit about how they identified, appraised, and synthesized the evidence to back up the claims that they were making. And a lot of what we called old school expert panels. And I'll come back to how important it is to have expert panels that have content expertise, methods expertise, and people with lived experience, and how important it is to support those panels with the best evidence and to encourage them to make recommendations in ways that are very transparent about how strong the evidence is backing up their claims. We also saw select forms of evidence getting a lot of attention, data analytics, modeling, and evaluation, but many other forms of evidence not getting the necessary amount of attention. So qualitative insights, for example, about how racialized communities have been treated in the past with evidence and with dictates from government, and how that then affected how they responded to the evidence that they were seeing in COVID-19 and how they responded to the recommendations that were being made. The final insight from the COVID evidence response that led us to create the Evidence Commission is we were finding very often people were ignoring the context for policymakers' use of evidence, not looking at what was happening in central government agencies, in the science and technology ministry, and in all of the other line ministries like health, and also not necessarily understanding that there are often in-house units with particular capacity, formal partnerships that can be leveraged, and UN system entities like the World Health Organization and UNICEF that can be part of the evidence response. So this led us to the Evidence Commission. We brought together 25 commissioners from around the globe, coming from every major world region, covering the full array of societal challenges and all types of decision makers. So government policy makers like Fitsum, an Ethiopian cabinet minister, organizational leaders, professionals, and also citizens. You'll see in the top right corner, Daniel Iberê Alves de Silva, our Brazilian commissioner, a young indigenous leader, educating students and others about indigenous ways of knowing. And he contributed a very powerful section about indigenous peoples and indigenous ways of knowing and how those ways of knowing need to be put alongside evidence. The Evidence Commission report had two main goals: to provide the context, concepts, and vocabulary that underpin work in this area, and to provide recommendations about how we can and must improve the use of evidence, both with future global crises like the one that we've been living through for the last 2 years, but also in routine times. The report is available in 7 languages, and we're delighted that one of them is Portuguese, which is because of the very generous contributions of Fiocruz Brasilia and the leadership of Jorge Barreto, who oversaw all of this work. And we work closely with him and his colleague Cassia to make available the report in Portuguese. Some recent coverage of key messages from the report. Nature, a very prominent science magazine, wrote an editorial spurred by the Evidence Commission. It was called Wanted: Better Systems for Turning Evidence into Action. But you'll also see other examples here: a guest essay in the New York Times about misinformation, an article in The Conversation, a blog post written by another commissioner, the head of the UK Cabinet Office's Behavioural Insights team. So next, I'll talk through some of the key concepts that are covered in the Evidence Commission report, and I'll cover 4 sets of concepts. The first have to do with what we call the 8 forms of evidence in which the 8 forms, I should say, in which evidence is typically encountered by decision makers. We found this helpful in being able to speak across different constituencies. And here we're speaking to decision makers. If I was speaking to researchers talking about types of research, I would use different language. But often decision makers encounter evidence in these 8 forms. And a lot of the Evidence Commission report then leverages discussions about these 8 forms of evidence. Related to this, the Evidence Commission report makes the case that we need to match the form of evidence to the right step in the decision-making process. So there's a lot of focus nowadays on data analytics, and we heartily agree, very helpful in understanding problems and their causes, very helpful in monitoring implementation and an input into evaluating impacts. Not as helpful in selecting an option for addressing a problem or identifying implementation considerations. Whereas when we come to something like behavioral and implementation research, very critical in working through implementation considerations. But we also need to be able to go in the opposite direction, to map the step or the question within the step in decision-making to the right form of evidence. So if we're trying to select an option to address a problem, we would look for benefits and harms in some forms of evidence, for cost effectiveness in another form, and for stakeholder views and experiences in yet another form. So very important to understand these different forms of evidence and how they add value in different ways. The second set of concepts that are critical in the Evidence Commission report are how important it is to rely on the combined power of local evidence, could be national or provincial or state evidence. So what has been learned in my country, my province or state or my city, but combine that with global evidence. What has been learned from around the world, including how it varies by groups and contexts. For some issues, all of the global evidence may be relevant. For other issues in a specific country like Brazil, only some of that evidence may be relevant. You'll see here that we've arrayed 5 of the forms of evidence as typically national or local evidence: data analytics, modeling, evaluation, behavioral and implementation research, and qualitative insights. Then another form of evidence is the source of global evidence. And then finally, we have forms of recommendations or evidence support that are informed by that evidence. And those two forms of evidence typically are technology assessments and guidelines. So they take the next step and make recommendations. On the right side, you'll see a reference to something I mentioned earlier. One of the big innovations that accelerated dramatically during COVID-19 were living evidence syntheses. These add new evidence as the evidence is made available based on its quality. So we have a continually evolving picture about what the entire evidence base, not just the newest study, tells us. Good ones also describe how much certainty we can have about particular findings, and they don't accept the journal's peer review as synonymous with quality. A good living evidence synthesis would look at both published and unpublished literature and judge the quality of each of the studies included in the synthesis using the same explicit criteria. The third set of concepts have to do with using the right strategies to support the use of best evidence for the right issues and contexts. And on the left-hand side, you'll see 5 types of strategies that evidence intermediaries can use to support the use of best evidence. In terms of improving the climate for evidence use, one example would be requiring government science advisors to speak in a way that makes it possible to judge their accuracy rather than accepting unquestionably their personal opinions. For prioritizing and co-producing evidence, we've highlighted here co-producing that evidence with decision makers and affected communities. And during COVID-19, with the COVID and evidence syntheses, we had citizen partners who were co-authors on the products, often produced in timelines as short as 1 to 3 days, but certainly always within 5 to 10. So citizens who were affected by the very issue were at the table as the evidence synthesis was being produced and helped to make the decisions about that evidence synthesis. In terms of packaging and pushing the evidence to decision makers, here we've kind of turned it around and we've talked about how important it is to provide timely, demand-driven, contextualized, equity-focused evidence products that say, if this is your issue, whether it's about a problem or options for addressing it, here in as short a timeline as you give us is our summary of what the best evidence is for Brazil, and ideally using an equity lens, because often the findings don't apply to everyone, and we need to know who do they apply to, and what about particular equity deserving groups that warrant particular attention. An example of facilitating pull, making it easier for decision makers to reach into the world of evidence and pull out what they need. Here we have the example of one-stop evidence shops. And I previously gave you the example of the COVID and inventory of evidence syntheses that identified the best evidence syntheses for any COVID-19 decision. And finally, in terms of exchanging with decision makers, one of the things that we and others are now starting to do as a result of watching in the clinical space living guideline panels, we are now starting to embark on a process of convening living citizen panels and living stakeholder dialogues that will meet periodically as the evidence and the context and the issue changes, to give unfolding insights about how they think we need to be moving forward in ways that are attentive both to the evidence, but also citizen values and stakeholder insights. The fourth and final concept from the Evidence Commission report is that we need to formalize the evidence support system. So all of our countries have a research system where the focus is supporting investigator-driven research, We often have an innovation system. Brazil's is actually much more advanced than Canada's, but where we support innovation. But we very often don't formalize and specifically invest in the evidence support system. And in the Evidence Commission report, we talk about that system needing to be grounded in an understanding of the national context, including the time constraints in which decision makers work under. It needs to be demand driven rather than supply side driven on the part of researchers. And it needs to focus on contextualizing the evidence for a given decision in an equity sensitive way. And on this slide, repeating some of the comments from earlier slides, I have 4 examples of infrastructure. We need, in any country, evidence units that can combine the power of national evidence that tell us what has been learned in that country with the power of global evidence that tell us what has been learned from around the world. We also need expert panels that follow rigorous processes to develop evidence-based recommendations. We need government science advisors who speak in a way that make it possible to judge their accuracy. And we need many processes to prioritize evidence needs, to find and package evidence that meets those needs within set time constraints, that strengthen capacity for evidence use, but also that incorporate evidence use into routine processes. So making evidence part of what goes to a cabinet for decision, making evidence part of what goes to the Ministry of Finance as part of a budget proposal. So the Evidence Commission recommendations, 24 in total, and the Evidence Commission Secretariat is currently focused on implementation in 3 areas. One is in green, domestic evidence infrastructures, and this targets primarily government policymakers and funders. The second priority is the global evidence architecture, and that primarily targets evidence producers. And the final one it focuses on evidence in everyday life, and that primarily targets citizens. And I'll just talk briefly about each of them in the final part of my presentation. So implementation priority 1, strengthening domestic evidence infrastructures through rapid learning and improvement. So in phase 1, we're currently working with 20 different jurisdictions around the world. And what each group is doing is looking at what is happening with evidence use in their central agencies and in 3 departments, or for cross-cutting topics like net zero emissions, they're looking across departments. And they're asking what's going well and what could be improved in terms of in-house units that support evidence use, what's going well or could be improved in formal partnerships, and what's going well and what could be improved in how UN system entities like UNICEF support decision-making. The methods are very light touch, meant to quickly get a sense of what are the priorities in terms of what needs to be systematized or scaled up. So what's going well that we need to leverage, and what gaps do we need to fill, ideally before COVID-19 evidence investments come to an end. One of the metaphors that we use when we start to share the findings from this rapid assessment is the metaphor of getting to the podium in a sporting event like the Olympics. And we find this as a way of helping people understand what the future could look like. So on this particular example, using Canada as the country of focus, you'll see for the most part in this area, we're not yet on the podium. So for COVID-19, the vast majority of our expert panels used an old school approach, which we call good old boys sitting around the table. Those panels didn't convene people with the right mix of issue-specific knowledge, evidence appraisal expertise, and lived experience. They weren't supported to follow rigorous process to develop their recommendations. And for the most part, they weren't living panels that adjusted their recommendations as the evidence and situation evolved. We had one example that we thought made it to the podium, our National Advisory Committee on Immunization, but we kept saying and continue to say, how did Australia back in April of 2020 set up a living COVID guideline process that adjusted the recommendations as often as every week in ways that meets the criteria on the left-hand side of the slide? So that to us is an aspirational example, and we would love to see our country go for the gold in that way in this domain. In other domains, we may be on the podium, and in yet other domains, we may have no examples yet that are on the podium. Implementation priority 2 is enhancing and leveraging the global evidence architecture. So countries like Brazil, Canada, even the very large United States can't do everything. They need to look to global evidence syntheses produced by different groups around the world and be able to combine that with their national evidence. WHO has actually, along with UNICEF, been quite an exemplar in using rigorous approaches. And it did that during COVID-19. It now needs to start doing that across the full range of health challenges we face in its norms and standards, in its technical assistance, and in its support for evidence-related global public goods like living evidence syntheses. But most other UN system entities still use an expert knows best model for normative guidance and technical assistance, and don't invest in evidence-related global public goods. There's some, we hope, wins that we can pursue collectively, getting the UN to adjust the quintet of change to talk about more forms of evidence, taking the opportunity of the UN Secretary General upgrading this or reinvigorating the Scientific Advisory Board to really function as an evidence support system architect for the UN, and not to be an old style panel with Nobel scientists that are primarily focused on research as opposed to stronger national evidence support systems. There's also a role for the producers of evidence-related global public goods, Cochrane, Campbell, Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. They need to improve their prioritization, become better coordinated, foreground equity and context considerations in their work. And then finally, funders. They need to invest in the global evidence infrastructure, but they also need to invest in national evidence support systems. The final implementation priority is more aspirational. This is a many-year-long path to putting evidence at the center of everyday life. When we make decisions about which organizations we volunteer with, which organizations we donate money to, which claims we believe in the newspaper, we should be able to go to sources that have evidence built into how they work. So we're currently trying to come up with a list of curated resources that are exemplars about how we could start to put evidence at the center of everyday life for citizens. So some conclusions, my final slide. It feels to me that in the 25 years that I've been working in this space, we've moved more in the last 2 years than we had in all the previous years combined. It feels to me and many others that we're facing a once-in-a-generation opportunity to work with political leaders to build on the right lessons learned from our own and from other countries. And I would offer you 5 arguments for why we need to do this now. First, we have a cadre of political leaders who have personal experience with what worked well and what could have worked better. Second, we've seen these innovations in evidence products and processes like living evidence syntheses, living guidelines. These need to become the new normal. Third, COVID-19 evidence investments are coming to an end. That money shouldn't just disappear. It should be invested in formalizing and strengthening the evidence support system. Fourth, there are lessons learned about needing to have evidence and supports in place that can pivot to address health emergencies. We can't just start from scratch when the next health emergency strikes. We need to build in more peacetime environments the infrastructure that can pivot during crises. And finally, there's a recognition of the growing array of health challenges other than COVID-19, where best evidence is needed. One of the most striking examples, of course, is with climate change. The final two comments: we need context-specific assessments to identify what's working well and what gaps exist, especially in domestic evidence support systems. What Brazil would prioritize as next steps may look very different from what Canada sees as next steps. And we think a rapid learning and improvement approach to systematize and scale up what's working and fill the gaps is the way to go. Just continually trying to up our game. So those are some conclusions. I think I stayed within time, and I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it back to Laura.
Thank you so much, John. This was so enlightening, and we are very happy to have also the report in Portuguese. I will now give time for Ulysses to speak. Professor Ulysses Panicet, who works in the Federal University of Minas Gerais, but also is a great evidence leadership and champion in Brazil, who was Secretariat of the Evidence Informed Policy Network from the WHO until 2014. And Ulysses will try to comment a bit how this wonderful report relates to our reality from this point of view of all networks and also the university. So Ulysses, just let me allow you to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Laura, and I'm so glad to be here with all of you. And John, thank you so much for opening new doors and windows once again with solid, innovative, and I would say even revolutionary action to improve the quality of life of people at a global scale. In Brazil, of course, the leadership and actions of Jorge Barreto and Laura Boeira, with so many others that would be impossible to quote here, has put Brazil in the world map of evidence-informed policymaking for impact. So my task is very difficult because both Laura Boeira and Jorge and so many others have a clear view of what's going on in Brazil now. So I would like to ask you for two issues. First, to highlight that the Evidence Commission report is most of all a call to solidarity with our fellow citizens all over the planet. My task today is, of course, to discuss the impact of the report for Brazilian academia. And Tamil will comment about its impact on government. However, I strongly believe that we cannot discuss academia separately from the whole society, divided as this society may be. So, as this timely report reminds us, COVID-19 demanded from everybody the use of the best available evidence to diminish the staggering number of casualties it brought to our homes and protect people from its tragic toll. In Brazil as well, the pandemic has engendered, and I quote, a once-in-a-generation focus on evidence among government, business, civil society organizations, many types of professionals, and a breakthrough of a majority of Brazilians in understanding how crucial research evidence is. And this by itself would be a great feat. Almost 80% of Brazilians understood and welcomed vaccines in spite of all the criminal propaganda against vaccines led by Brazil's president as a poster boy for denialism. Vaccination was assured thanks to our unique universal health system with its primary health and family health strategy, created with the best available evidence of what works and the commitment of dedicated health workers. So the report comes to us as scholars, academics, professors, researchers, as a wake-up call to the fact that the huge ground covered in the past 2 decades to advance the use of evidence for decision-making represented a great achievement, but is not enough for the most challenging needs of our troubled times. It's our moral and ethical imperative to consolidate, my point of view, the role of research evidence in our society, while the society continues plagued by well-funded and malicious disinformation, fake news, and wide open lies that serve crooked politicians and shady businesses. Therefore, our work as researchers and knowledge translators demands a high level of social commitment and integrity that goes beyond our publications. Brazilian researchers have a long history of commitment to social causes, engaging with our social reality and joining forces to identify and respond to social needs in health, education, social services, micro and microeconomics, to mention some. The pandemic brought to daylight more than ever the enormous inequalities persisting in our society, among the most unequal in a world of inequalities. To mention just one, hunger has increased, as pointed out by a study about food insecurity organized by the Fundação Getúlio Vargas and released last week. In the last 12 months alone, the hardship to feed a family and days without food on the table was up from 30 to 36% of the population, largest than the world average of 35%. And even worse, women experienced lack of food on the table from 33% a year ago to 47%. How can we not dedicate our best efforts to address this and other major challenges? How can we fail to use advanced methods and tools that the report recommends, evaluating policies implemented when every life counts? The spillover of the pandemic, not only on health, but on all aspects of our daily lives, in food security, jobs, housing, transportation, education, with huge impact on all national and global social determinants of health that threatens to come back tainted to haunt us. Social determinants of health, as proposed by Paulo Bus and Alberto Pellegrini Filho, as the social, economic, cultural, ethnic, racial, psychological, and behavioral factors that influence the occurrence of health problems and the risk factors in population, or basically often harsh social conditions in which people live and work. In this situation, I strongly believe, as Nancy Krieger proposes, an element of intervention and transformation of factors and mechanisms through which social conditions affect health and which potentially can be changed through information-based actions. In Brazil, the use of research evidence in decision-making departed the realm of doctrine and became a reality through several well-situated evidence-informed policy-making teams, health technology assessment teams, and evidence-based guidance. However, the report is a dynamic reminder that there is not a straight line between evidence to action. Much need to be there's a much need to have this continuously. We need to improve the climate, as the report mentions clearly, conditions and financing for evidence use in decision-making. Many of us reached the printed press, radio, and TV, and the social media to provide evidence-informed proposals and help strengthen the pro-evidence climate. This needs to continue. And John, it was fantastic to see all the op-eds that the Commission proposed. And this will reach out tremendously and have an impact in opinion makers, which I think is fantastic. So I could not emphasize more the fundamental need of strengthening domestic evidence infrastructure, as the report says. This is fundamental for us. So Brazil advanced so much with very little institutional support, except for the Fiocruz and in some periods for the Ministry of Health. So this was done mostly with a generous amount of dedication by so many people, but we need to consolidate this in institutions that are not threatened by the change in government, by the political winds, by the ideological direction of things. We need to have structures that are in institutions that serve the public continuously. So we need to assure that our institutions evolve their capacity to develop a committed workforce ready to address problems that wreak havoc to our people, to assure the on-the-job permanent education of learning by doing in links and exchange with decision makers, in co-production and prioritizing with feedback from citizens, which is just fundamental. What John mentioned as living citizens panels is music to Brazilian ears. The controle social, or the control by society, is outmoded for some groups, but is an essential feature of the unified health system and for Brazilian threatened democracy. Learn how to better package evidence and knowing how to better push it to decision makers while facilitating and motivating pull by decision makers. This is fundamental. And this is something that you don't do by decree. You have to build, you have to construct, you have to straighten the links as much as you can in a continuous, permanent basis of link and exchange. So this past Monday, 14.5% of Brazilian public university funds were cut by the current government, but we can resist even in this adverse situation and promote, as John proposes, context-specific rapid assessments to identify why, for instance, my hometown of Belo Horizonte was successful in addressing COVID-19. What gaps exist with domestic evidence support systems? We have to identify this and work on this. So following John's challenge, we can use a rapid learning and improvement approach in the remainder of 2022 to systematize and scale up what's working well and fill the gaps with these systems. And another issue that I would like to stress from the report is putting evidence at the center of everyday life. This is not just a slogan. This is a way of living, I would say, that we need to integrate as we brush our teeth and every day. I mean, it's something we have to do, we must do. And if we think vastly, during COVID-19, when people put masks and wash their hands and put alcohol gel and all the stuff, they were doing this. They were putting evidence in the center of everyday life. So all this democratic environment developed to engage citizens, the ultimate users of most policies, in which people have the right to know the basis for quality decisions. They have the right of knowledge. What am I doing? Why am I doing this? Why are you telling me to do this? And this is fundamental in a democratic society. Most of all, we must go beyond good intentions and make sure that equity permeates all our thinking. It's not just a label. It's the essence of all we do. That equity cuts through all actions, as the report highlights. And I think it's one of the core of this report. So our profound inequalities in Brazil require more than ever deciding with the best available evidence and methods in an equity-sensitive, transformative action that reports preaches. As I mentioned, the report is a call to solidarity with our fellow citizens of this planet. Let's get together and join hands for this life-changing task. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ulysses. This was so inspiring. And your last words on equity just reminded me of this great opportunity the Brazilian Coalition for Evidence is offering. Is actually ending the subscriptions today. We just had last year the first edition of our introductory course on evidence-informed policymaking and knowledge translation. Is a course, a 2-month course with mentorship. And this year we took a commitment, very much so pushed by John's request when they first started doing the Evidence Commission selection of commissioners. He requested some tips about how can we bring a super Brazilian researcher force to this commission. And we had a hard time finding someone who really represented the diversity of Brazil. So for this year, the Brazilian Coalition for Evidence course is focusing on diversity, on equity. We are providing scholarships for early career researchers who are diverse in gender, race, who are part of the North and Northeast regions of Brazil, who are frequently underrepresented. And we are so happy to have as of today, more than 100 early career researchers from all over the country interested in our course. We are trying to expand as much as we can the course to accommodate everyone. And I put the link in the chat box because today is the last day. So if you know anyone, if you want to make people included in this debate, if you believe, as the coalition believes, that all Brazilians, all diversity of our country should be represented in this debate, do share this. And thank you so much, John, because your early provocation there helped us really design this course, and we adapted much of the materials. And some of the materials you were just sharing in your slides about how to make evidence part of the day-to-day life will be very useful also for this debate. So thank you so much, Ulysses. It was super inspiring to hear your analysis, and very much more than the academia, but really a call for action for all the Brazilian society. So now finishing up our round of presenters, and just wanted to flag out that whomever has questions can post them in Portuguese or English in the chat box, and Georgie will spark the debate after we finish. We'll hear from Tamily Diaz. Tamily is a member of the Brazilian Coalition for Evidence, but also a public servant at the National School for Public Administration, and is working in the Evidence Express service from ENAP. So Tamily, welcome. Let me allow you to unmute yourself. and I'll share your slides.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Laura, for this brilliant opportunity to be here with you today. I'm very pleased and honored to share this panel with Professor Laves and Professor Ulisses, sorry. My name is Tamili, and I am an evaluation and evidence advisor for the National School of Public Administration. The acronym in Portuguese is ENAP. So I will quickly present what ENAP does and which hat I am wearing on today. So next slide, please, Laura.
Do confirm that it's changing, please. Can you see the next one?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Perfect, thank you. So ENAP is a national school of government. It is a federal government organization that assists the whole government system in terms of training. So ENAP also works as an innovation agency. We also design and test new solutions to policy challenges. So we are both a school in charge of training the civil service and an innovation and project design hub. And in addition, we also do scientific research, knowledge communication. We have a peer-reviewed journal, and we do offer short and long courses to our civil service staff. And we also offer a range of demand-driven service, such as assisting a ministry or a government unit to design or evaluate their policy. As you can imagine, ENAP, as a center of government institution, plays a very important role in the government knowledge production system, both as assisting civil service capacity building and as a center of knowledge diffusion. So next slide, please. My specific unit, the one I am here representing, is the department responsible for connecting knowledge to practice. We overview the postgraduate courses, the research promotion, funding and communication, and the demand-driven evaluation service. And that's my current position in the policy evaluation and evidence unit. We offer a sort of help desk to conduct policy analysis. We also facilitate in-depth and collaborative policy evaluation, and also regulatory impact assessment. We are working at the kind of an intersection of research and policy, mainly through generating policy relevant evidence. We also have this unit that Laura mentioned, that's called Evidence Express, which is also a demand-driven research unit that provides quick access to evidence and analysis of any kind of policy, any topic, any program questions through rapid response. Our reports reveal available evidence, experience, practice, synthesis of findings from literature. We analyze data, both descriptive and inferential. So the evidence we provide is always demanded by some ministry or government unit to inform something they are doing. So that could be an evaluation, a policy formulation, some normative act. It is also important to state that Brazil has a permanent civil service career, which means that most of the employees in the public sector do not change when the government changes. So regardless of election results, the technical body of employees stays. And I reckon this is an important information when discussing the evidence infrastructure and how we should enhance the evidence uptake, because a significant part of Brazilians' bureaucracy is being constantly trained by us at the school and also willing to learn more about the evidence world. And perhaps this is a blind spot that we should not leave out when discussing strategies to improve the government evidence uptake, which are the features of people working day to day in the policy process. So next slide, please. And this leads to my first observation about how the Global Commission on Evidence report could support us addressing societal challenges, bringing evidence to decision-making process. It is important to unpack government. Usually we talk about the government as the whole homogeneous box, but we need to look at the government and its processes and the complex networks of actors, players, institutions, all the processes that encompasses the role of governments. And I'm not only talking about the institutional settings, which is also very, very relevant. I am also referring to a deep observation of the kind of architecture of decision-making, identifying the real possibilities of a more significant and how these complex power structures and stakeholders operate, and where there are some gaps or possibilities where evidence could be inserted. It is mainly how the architecture of decision-making is set up, dynamics, for example, dynamics between legislative and executive branches, or how civil society groups participate, shape, and influence decisions. In that sense, the report section for government policymakers and the context for the use of evidence is very helpful for us to begin to identify the processes that could provide a way in for evidence. And the framework of decision-making as a series of steps also helps us to classify the complexity of the problem and nature of decision. So next slide, please. And here I could identify two main possibilities. The first one is to track the path to unveil where and how research evidence could be used. For this task, I would highlight the important role of evidence intermediaries or knowledge brokers. And the second one is to identify what we sort of already do. What I mean is some government units that are bringing or promoting some sort of evidence and are not quite aware what evidence intermediaries mean, or a national evidence infrastructure could be and their role in it. I'm talking about units that usually are responsible for producing or promoting research focused on their policy topic, or units responsible for analyzing their own administrative data record, their dashboards. In a sort of way, they already play a role of evidence intermediaries. It's a tricky word, but we don't use those words to describe, and they're not even aware of the tools and strategies that playing that role could present, because they don't see themselves within this vocabulary. So maybe we need to spread the word about evidence systems and infrastructure, about also tools, methods, strategies, roles, activities. And in that sense, the report provides this brilliant concepts, vocabulary, the context that underpin work in this area. And reflecting on what the report can help us to clarify, organize, and identify what we already have in terms of evidence systems and infrastructure, but they're not articulated as so, or not even aware that those kind of things exist. So we need to identify those that have similar tasks and improve their possibilities for action, because these people, and I'm talking about people, not only institutions, people, they're inside the routine of a ministry. They know better about their policies. They have access somehow to the decision makers. And it's also about daily routine that could be boosted with a specific kind of training for the people involved, or a better infrastructure for sure, or even coordinated efforts. It seems to be also a paradox between the lack of evidence use and the waste of evidence production in government. which demonstrates a lack of governance or coordination between the evidence production and the practical need for it. For instance, research reports that are ordered by the ministries that no one end up reading or discussing because somehow it was not articulated with the real demand for information to decide, meaning that the decision was oriented by something else different from that research report. Other example of waste of evidence are the systems and dashboards shortly used or understood. So we have heavy public budget invested in building those fashionable dashboards that the policymakers do not even remember they have, or even worse, that are not updated with the current data, or that no one can operate the dashboards or understand what that information is really showing. So in that sense, I would like to highlight the report recommendation that says each government can also review their mainstream structures and processes to formalize the ways in for evidence. And that brings the other topic we must talk about, what we need to further develop to create and to improve the use of the evidence in decision making. So as the report recommends, we need to imagine an evidence support system that would set the motivation to use evidence in government policy making. Institutionalization, although it is most relevant in this case, does not answer alone to all our concerns. It is hard to state that a top-down institutionalization and enforcement by themselves solely change practices. And I can give an example of that. In 2020, regulatory impact assessment, which is a sort of a kind of policy analysis, turned out to be mandatory in Brazil. That's 2020. For some types of normative acts, in the formulation of some types of normative acts. So before setting a rule, an agency is obligated to conduct a regulatory impact assessment and look at the evidence to be sure the chosen option is the best one. Without the pre-existing system that cushions the effect of litigation, it could lead to an implementation problem. So many government units do not know how to conduct a regulatory impact assessment, or neither if they actually need to do it or not. And we do not have a well set governance of evidence, so sometimes they don't know how to apply the suggested methods or where to seek for information. And besides what seems to be only a lack of training and understanding, it is a huge change in the organizational culture at the time of decision-making. What seems to be an upgrade in terms of evidence use is about institutionalization, but also and mostly about changing the organizational culture, bringing the skills, the routines, day-to-day in almost a micro-sociological way. Things that we need to sort out in routine times, in putting evidence at the center of everyday life, also for those who work in and for governments, right? Next slide, please. But how we do that? We need to set this topic and the public agenda. So different actors should talk about evidence use. And this is a very, very interesting contribution of the report. It's a call for solidarity. As Professor Ulysses told us. Often we think governments are those responsible for everything policy related. But one aspect I personally agree with the report is that government is one of many actors regarding evidence use and one of many players addressing societal challenges. So it seems that in order to strengthen the evidence agenda and the implementation of evidence support systems, we could focus on the interaction between all these actors. Government alone, packed with these multiple players, levels of decision, levels of implementation, levels of data production, etc., would not thrive alone in using the best evidence to inform policymaking without society. It is clear that we need to speak out this agenda in a systematic way, tailored to our institutions, to our historical aspects of policymaking and the way our governments interact with society. And here by we, I mean we people from this country and many others in the global south called up to bring evidence to the decision-making process. Next slide, please. Additionally, I would like to highlight two aspects quickly of evidence production. First, the importance of local evidence. Things that are very historically specific regarding a social or economic problem, or even how the policy system is organized. I mean, we are a federation in Brazil, and that means different levels of policy implementation, autonomy, especially in social policy. And we have faced some specific knowledge gaps in terms of local evidence, and we do need to improve that. Also, there is the language barrier. It is a brilliant thing that this report we're here discussing today is being translated to Portuguese and to many other languages. We do not speak English in Brazil. If we want to bring evidence to practice to daily decision making, we need to speak Portuguese and do research in Portuguese. Another aspect I would like to highlight in evidence production is the need for more policy-oriented research. And I know that a bit out of practice, because sometimes the ministries come to ANAP looking for the evidence support we offer, because we operate in between research and the policy process. But it's obvious that we cannot pick up all the demand for evidence in the federal government. So what we need is to build up an evidence support system, or systems in plural, and mostly bringing the gap of research that could be useful to a policy decision making. Next slide. So to wrap up and finish this presentation, allow me to list some words of action to help us organize where should aim at and summarize a bit what the report brought up for me. So first of all, coordinating and communicating efforts, creating connections, strengthening local production of policy relevant research, identifying the already existing effort, training people, developing multiple skills related to this field, recognizing that different forms of evidence are actually complementary, spreading the word, showing the vocabulary, the possibilities of action, tools, methods, focusing on the interactions between actors, engaging the civil society, building up our national evidence infrastructure through learning, institutionalization, and training, and recognizing distinct needs for different types of decision makers, and bringing the tailored evidence to each case. It's really important that one. And setting the agenda up, this agenda of the evidence use, as a means to strengthen democracies. And the last slide. So thank you all so very much for this opportunity, and a huge congratulations to the Global Commission for its excellent work. I really hope this report sets a new level of discussion and practice for using the best evidence. And I could say a more complex one and closer to reality, that's for sure. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Tamili. So right now, I will ask Professor Jorge Barreto from Fiocruz Brasilia to share a few words on what we heard. And if you have any questions for the speaker, Jorge, please do set them. And anyone from the audience who wants to pose questions can use the chat box as well.
Sure, thank you, Laura. We don't have much time, and I will have a very brief commentary about the presentations. First of all, I have to say a big thank to the presenter, especially for Professor John Leaves and for all my colleagues, Brazilian colleagues, Tamili and Ulysses. Very, very important and interesting interventions and very, very important conversation. In a nutshell, I think we have in Brazil Brazil is a very big country and have a lot of diversities, including inequalities in terms of diversity of inequality. I'm not sure that's a good thing because in different parts of the country have different and important problems for different groups of different people. And I would like to take this point to reinforce the idea. The Global Commission on Evidence take a lot of work to provide this very structured result, the report. And we should to see that to understand a very important opportunity to have a roadmap, to have different discussions inside the country, because the diversity of the group that developed this report is a very, very strong point to understand. We could enable a process to contextualize the topics and the ideas of the report. In order to address a question presented by our colleague Thais Borges, Thais mentioned by the chat, in the private chat, Brazil have a different levels and different contexts, include different profiles inside the government and inside the society in order to support evidence-informed policy making. And Thais asked if the Global Commission considered, if the Global Commission considered this diversity in order to address ideas, especially to the local context, and if yes, how we can take these ideas to implement a roadmap to discussion and to the action, because the report is not a first step, of course, because we have a lot of work behind the scenes, and but we have a very, very interesting way to seek and to have the next steps looking forward, to expand the ideas and to take the report as a very, very useful tool to have discussions in our country. Well, I talk much more than I can. Please, I'm looking forward to have your ideas again.
Wonderful. Georgie, I would just add one question to Thais' question. That is, and then it will be your closing remarks, John, Ulysses, and Tamili. So thank you so much for being here today. My question would be, given that you all are part of networks and the Global Commission effort was a huge one, engaging different people and organizations, if you have any recommendations for the Brazilian Coalition for Evidence, we just turned 1 year old. So we are a very new network, but we are very keen on picking your brain on how to best work with multiple organizations that focus on different subjects and different levels of government as well. So if you can address these 2 questions, I'll start with John again. And of course, John, if you want to comment your fellow speakers' presentations, you're welcome to do so.
Well, maybe I'll do that first, because I wrote in the private chat box to Ulysses, very inspiring and so well said. I think he should run for office again. So I think that was a lovely set of comments. And I hope no Canadians listen to my next comment, which is that I wish we had a Tamile in our equivalent of ANAP in Canada. We have a Canada School of Public Service who we have now opened a line of conversation to. So fingers crossed that we can find a Tamile with whom we can work, who understands this and sees the opportunities. For Thais's comment, we worked very hard to bring in multiple forms of diversity into the Evidence Commission deliberations, and we explicitly identified equity as a cross-cutting thread through the entire report. But at the end of the day, we knew that if action was going to happen, it had to happen at the national level, the state and provincial level, and the local level. And it has to be owned by local countries. And so, as you saw me say, how we think is the helpful way to frame it is for countries to look at the many things that are going well, that need to be systematized or scaled up, and then also perhaps talk less about what's not going well, but identify the opportunities for doing better. Of everything you could do, what would be the next logical steps, whether you're, in a province in the north of Brazil, or a state in the north of Brazil, or if you're in the federal government in a particular line ministry, what would be the next steps that would take you one step further, and then learn and improve. So I think action is going to take many different forms that need to reflect the full diversity of countries like Brazil. And then in terms of engaging the network, I mean, I don't know that we have great process solutions there, but you identified, I think correctly, the issue is how do we bring people together who come at this from multiple angles? And I'll be honest that we came into it with an evidence synthesis angle, but over time I came to appreciate just how critical data analytics was, and how powerfully complementary modeling is, and how important behavioral and implementation research is. And if we can create a space where we all play to our comparative advantages, and we collaborate with that focus on making a real difference in society, I think we will make a really big difference in the lives of the citizens of our countries. So I'll just end it there and turn it over to Ulysses, hopefully a future politician.
Well, John, thank you so much. I mean, I really believe in, and I will not apologize for my passion. So, yeah, I really believe that my motivation, for instance, comes in great part from the commitment to society, to help improving people's life. And I think that's our basic start point of all of us. So, I think this is fundamental, and otherwise we risk becoming just paper pushers, and that's not what we are. So it's very dynamic. It's very it's a living work, as there are others. So one of the issues that I think I would like to have highlighted more is what you mentioned about the living citizen panels. I really think this is fundamental, and John and I, have discussed this since the beginning of our journey in EvipNet. This would be crucial for everything. So the other thing that I wish to highlight is that by the way, Laura and Jorge, the Brazilian Coalition for Evidence is just something that needed to have happen, and I'm very glad it's there. And so let's go to the press as well, to, and not only social media, but let's go to the press. I know lots of people in the press that would be interested in doing this on the second page of newspapers. So, I think this is something we have to do. And the other thing is that I have heard some people that profess the neoliberal vision of the world saying, see, so much happened in Brazil with so little support from the state, from the government. And look at this. And I say, yeah, great, brilliant. But can you imagine how farther we could go if we had the right resources, the right funding? This would really be a revolution in terms of policymaking. So, let's work for this, and let's have hope and hope and hope.
Thank you so much, Ulysses. Tamili, would you share your final words today?
Okay, just I'm gonna quickly comment on the questions. So I agree that the next course of action should take many forms, and that's an absolute truth regarding how diverse and how complex our realities are in Brazil. So that's something we should bear in mind while talking about all those kind of hard things like institutionalization and agenda setting, because the course of action is going to take many forms, and that's not going to talk about only bills in the Congress, but also how people in the small cities are talking about evidence, how street level bureaucrats and practitioners are talking about evidence with the people. So many forms is not that one thing is more important than the others, but all together is how we're gonna have our evidence system infrastructure well set and ready for the next challenges. So that's a matter that concerns the democratic debate as well. So this year we have elections, so it's really important that the evidence is used to address societal challenges, specifically societal challenges. It's important to be there when we are talking about the project of development of which country we want to have. So this is a core part of the democratic debate as well. So it's kind of whether or how evidence is used. It's also a political decision, so we cannot neglect this very important aspect. And my last comment is the role of the multilateral organizations that well, they do often help to set agendas and transferring knowledge, instruments, policy content throughout their recommendations, conferences, and etc. And yeah, I agree with that. And the report, we as also the coalition, we are agreeing with Ulysses that we should go to press a little bit more and be there in the democratic debate, and also strengthen our relationships with these multilateral organizations because of their power to set agenda and transferring knowledge and instruments. And my last comment is that as a federal government institution, we also have this, and ENACTI and the government, the federal government as a whole, we have this responsibility also of diffusion innovations in sort of ways. So in terms of norms, recommendations, and practices, and that's something I would call up for the federal government to look more to what we can do and what we are spreading and diffusion in terms of good practices and knowledge to our subnationals, and not just to see what they're doing, but set that as a goal in terms of interaction and cooperation and doing it together, as I believe it's the spirit of this report. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, John, Ulysses, Tamili, Georgie. We leave this session filled with hope and warm hearts and a sense of connection and solidarity. So this is very, very inspiring to all of us. Have a great day wherever you are. And thank you so much for joining us today. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.